Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin had planned to capture the two Russian military leaders that he's been opposing as part of the aborted mutiny. But Russian intelligence found out about the plot before it was to be executed. This all according to the Wall Street Journal's reporting. NBC's chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker asked the president whether Prigozhin planned to capture Russian military leaders. He said, quote, "That remains to be seen." Secretary of State Tony Blinken, appearing today on Morning Joe, and was asked about Putin's weaknesses.
You had a direct challenge to Putin's authority from Prigozhin. You see dissension in the ranks, and it's not as if you need a satellite to figure that out.
Does a weakened Vladimir Putin and a divided Russian military help Ukraine?
To the extent that Moscow is distracted by its own internal divisions, that may help. To the extent that the Wagner forces themselves are no longer on the front lines, that could help because they have been effective. They just literally throw people into a meat grinder of Putin's own making, but that's had some effect.
And joining me now is Leon Panetta, former defense secretary and CIA director in the Obama administration, former White House chief of staff to President Clinton. And I should just say, in welcoming you, happy birthday, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for spending part of that birthday with us.
Thank you, Andrea. I reached the stage when I don't count anymore.
You may not be counting, but let me just say we just had a whole segment talking about the age issue with Joe Biden, and you are a walking advertisement in defiance of that issue. So congratulations. And let's start with what Secretary Blinken just said, that there is a direct challenge to Putin's authority. He's talked about the cracks in the Kremlin. What does this mean for Putin's future?
Well, there's no question that Putin has been weakened. You had a coup that threatened to basically disrupt what was happening in Russia. Any leader wants to have stability and control and order, particularly an autocrat. And for Putin not to have that because he was facing a coup really does undermine his projection of authority in Russia. And so there's no question in my mind that Putin has been weakened by it. He's going to try to survive at this stage, and he's surviving largely by continuing to lie about what really took place here and what really happened. And so it remains to be seen whether ultimately all of this is going to catch up with him.
But there's also, of course, division in the military. And what is your reaction to the report in the Wall Street Journal that Wagner Group leader Prigozhin planned to capture Shoigu and Gerasimov?
Didn't surprise me. I mean, Prigozhin has been pretty outspoken for a long period of time. And to some extent, look, I think Putin is paying a price for what he created here. After all, it was Putin who established the Wagner Group, who gave Prigozhin the money to be able to do the things he was doing. He deployed them to Asia, to Africa, to the Ukraine. And yet, when Prigozhin began to be very critical of Putin and the military and the leadership in Russia, Putin didn't do very much. And then when he tried to bring the Wagner Group into the Russian army, the military, that's when Prigozhin basically conducted the coup. So Putin bears a lot of blame here for what happened. And the real question is whether or not, at this point, having labeled these people traitors but not taken any action against them at all, whether that ultimately is going to come back to haunt him.
The New York Times is also reporting that Belarus, who is, of course, Lukashenko's leader, rather the Belarus leader, President Lukashenko, who is a creature really of Putin, is now saying openly that Putin suggested killing Prigozhin, but that Lukashenko urged him to avoid a rushed response. First of all, Lukashenko speaking out like this sends a certain signal. Your thoughts about that, but also, is Prigozhin really on a very short leash?
Well, again, you've got autocrats here basically trying to now tell their story according to their particular viewpoint, and Lukashenko is doing exactly that. He's showing that in many ways he was a hero here, that he was able to talk to Putin, that he was able to talk to Prigozhin. Prigozhin wanted to be able to capture the two leaders in Russia and have them turned over to him. Lukashenko said that's just not going to happen. And there's probably no question that Lukashenko did play a role here in trying to calm down Putin, who probably wanted to kill Prigozhin, and try to give both of them a little room to try to be able to pull back from the brink. And that's what's happened. But unfortunately, the real causes here of what resulted in this coup, the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, Putin's inability to gain control of that, all of that remains a reality that tells me that this remains still a very unpredictable situation in Russia.
With a weakened Putin, I know we're talking about earlier about whether this actually plays to Ukraine's benefit, but could it also prompt Putin to become more aggressive, if that's possible, and to be even worse, using his air power and his advantage to go after Ukraine?
Well, it's the old story of a wounded tiger, and right now Putin is wounded by virtue of what happened here with this coup, and he's going to try to do everything necessary to try to prove that he's still in control and he's still in charge, and if that means taking some kind of bold action, whether it's in the Ukraine or elsewhere, he's going to try to do that. On the other hand, he's also got to be careful, because if he does something stupid and adds to his problems, it could very well spell the end of his regime in Russia. So, yeah, it's a threat. We've got to watch him closely as to how he reacts. But at the same time, I don't think Putin is going to walk off a cliff by doing something that would really undermine his ability to maintain power in Russia.
Of course, the other major player is China, and they have so much invested in Putin. He was here this morning. Secretary Blinken was here this morning, and we also asked him about China and about China's intentions towards Taiwan. Let's watch. What is your impression about their timeline, President Xi's timeline regarding invading, trying to take over Taiwan? CIA Director Burns had said it would be within the next 5 years. He said that a year ago, and now President Xi has got his third term. Is that more imminent?
Andrew, the main concern that we've had with Beijing's approach to Taiwan is that it seems bent on changing the status quo that's prevailed for more than 50 years and has actually been a successful part of the relationship that we've had with China, making sure that we could maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, making sure that any differences were resolved peacefully, that no one on either side engaged in any unilateral effort to change the status quo. And we've had concerns going back to 2016, not just the last months, that China was acting more aggressively when it comes to Taiwan. So we had a very direct, very lengthy conversation about this. They have concerns about our policy. I clarified, to the extent it needed to be clarified, that our policy hasn't changed. We abide by, we stick to the longstanding one China policy.
But as a former defense secretary, how do you feel about the fact that China has not restored military-to-military communications? We have that with Russia, even most recently.
Well, it's still a concern. I recognize that there was an effort here, and it was an important effort to try to reestablish some kind of dialogue with China. I think we were successful in doing that. And I think Secretary Blinken took the right steps in trying to see if we could try to maintain better relationships. But it's also clear that China is not fully opening their arms to that relationship. And the fact that they haven't established communication on the military side concerns me, because that's the one place where any kind of miscalculation, any kind of stupid decision that's made by somebody who's either flying a reconnaissance plane or moving a destroyer across an area in the South China Sea. If that mistake is made and there's no ability to communicate and try to cool things down, then it could result in an even greater conflict. So I hope that we are able ultimately to reestablish those lines of communication. Look, right now, I think the greatest deterrent to China doing anything in Taiwan, the greatest deterrent is what's happening in the Ukraine and what just happened to Putin with this coup. I think Xi is going to be very careful about taking any steps that could jeopardize his control in China.